Hi folks, our next speaker is in my view the top construction economist in the UK. Dr. Noble Francis, Economics Director at the Construction Products Association, Honorary Professor at the Bartlett School of Construction, joins us to give his insight into the mess and muddle that is the UK economy in the midst of COVID and Brexit. Good morning, Noble. The first question I had for you is really, are we off the map in terms of the economic, where are we going? What does the shape of the recovery look like, Noble?
Okay, I mean, if we go to my second slide, which has our CPA economic scenarios, then we have a slide here that illustrates how we see the UK economy. The black line is what's happened to GDP, quarterly GDP, and clearly we had a sharp fall in the second quarter when we had the initial lockdown, which affected services, it affected manufacturing and construction. In the third quarter of the year, we had the recovery, which was quite sharp as the social distancing restrictions eased. And we have two scenarios. These were published back in October before the second lockdown. And our initial scenario is a sort of V shape, which is the blue-gray line. And what we envisaged is that in the third quarter, there would be a sharp recovery. And then after that, the rate of recovery would slow down, but we would have continued recovery. We also had an alternative scenario which covers what would have happened if there was a second lockdown, which now appears to be the case, and is the W shape, which is the green-gray dotted line, and it has a second dip in the final quarter of 2020 before sharp recovery after that. And what you notice in the second dip, which is the final quarter of the year, it doesn't go as far down as it did in Q2, and that's mainly because in this lockdown, construction hasn't been largely affected, manufacturing hasn't largely been affected. The main impact has been on person-to-person interaction services. So a significantly higher proportion of the economy is kept going during the second lockdown. Not only that, even in some services sectors, you've ended up with a higher degree of business continuity because they figured out how to work during a lockdown. So the second dip isn't as sharp. And then going forward, we're expecting significant recovery. Now that's for the UK economy as a whole. But if we go to the next slide, what I've done is highlight how construction output has been so far this year in the three biggest construction sectors. So far this year, this is all indexed to January this year, pre-COVID being 100. So it's how activities fared since then. And what you notice is that infrastructure was the least affected sector, even in March, April, and May. And that's because large construction sites, it's easier to enact social distancing. Plus you've got those key clients, government and regulated sectors, who are keen on keeping activity going. Commercial sector is shown in the orange line, and we lost around 40% of commercial activity in April, and activities recovered since then, but even in September, activity in commercial was still 20% lower than it was at the start of the year. Now that's partly because activity has been slower to recover on some of the sites. All the commercial sites are open, but they were slower to reopen. And not only that, you end up with a situation where productivity on site is lower than it was pre-COVID because of social distancing, and especially on commercial offices, towers, where you've got small groups of trades operating in a relatively small area. Then if we take the biggest construction sector, which is private housing, we lost over 60% of the sector in April, but it's recovered very sharply since then. Housing and house building is quite red hot at the moment. And you notice that government's been keen to sustain it with the stamp duty holiday and with the extension of the completions deadline for Help to Buy. It is really pushing house building. So that's how we see it in terms of what's occurred in construction so far this year. Looking forward, just quickly, just to say, looking forward, private housing is still looking as though there's going to be high demand there in the next 4 to 5 months. Infrastructure, we're looking at strong demand medium term there, but there is a question about what will happen to commercial demand. Who's making those major investments in commercial offices, towers, given the uncertainty over long-term demand?
Thank you, Neville. So if we move forward, where do you see the sort of silver linings for the sector as we move into the next phase?
Okay, I mean, if we look at the next slide, we've got a situation where we've got the key recovery. You're looking at the risks being around the second national lockdown, which is that we know the lockdown finishes on the 2nd of December, and we're going to have the economy reopening. Plus, government wants to have a break for Christmas and New Year. What we don't know is whether we end up with a lockdown in January. There's a high reliance on government policy in terms of pushing funding for infrastructure, stimulating housing. We have an issue around margins. Given that productivity is an issue on some sites, that raises the cost and means some commercial projects are delayed, which hits margins. And what will that be in terms of an issue going forward? And so from our perspective, if there's a hit to margins for contractors, then they're likely to push issues back onto the supply chain. But there are some areas in which we should be looking to see some silver linings, to see some areas in which we're looking for strong growth next year. Now, what I would like to do is skip to slide 8, which gives our main scenario for construction output going into next year. What we have is strong demand for infrastructure. And I realize that a lot of your members will switch off when I talk about infrastructure, because most companies think, well, I don't make ballast, I don't do tracks, but an awful lot of the infrastructure is for the buildings surrounding infrastructure. So if you're doing Crossrail, for instance, and you're doing Tottenham Court Road Station, there's a commercial offices, residential and retail tower there next to it, which is £400 million. So you're looking at a big sector, and all you need is a little niche from that sector. So it's always worth looking at some of the niches like infrastructure. You're also looking at public housing repair, maintenance and improvements, which is very skewed towards cladding remediation. And so there is going to be an awful lot of activity there next year. Government has an internal deadline for the end of this year for starting to remediate all high-risk towers, but it's likely to be late on that, which means the majority of that activity is going to be next year. If you look at some of the other areas, you've got private house building is going to have double-digit growth next year. Industrial, you're looking at double-digit growth. And overall within construction, you are looking at significant growth in quite a lot of the different sectors there. So there are some reasons to be cheerful going forward.
Excellent. And if we go back, I think if we go back to your earlier slide on the Brexit key product issues, obviously Brexit has potential to impact upon some of these areas. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear from the CPA where you see the big issues for Brexit in terms of how they're going to hit our sector.
Yeah, I mean, what we've assumed in our scenarios is that there will be a deal, albeit we're getting very close to the deadline. But if there is a no deal, then you're looking at key issues on the product side and on the labour side. One of our key issues is that businesses still aren't clear what they're supposed to be preparing for many firms haven't had the chance to build up stocks because there's been a sharp recovery in demand, as we saw on an earlier slide, in some of the sectors. And so if you look at areas like timber, roof tiles, white goods, you're looking at some key areas in which we don't have stocks. So if there is disruption in the first half of next year, that could provide a big problem for us. And that's just on the product supply issue. If you look at what the additional costs and administrative burdens may be, that may raise costs of imported products, materials, and components, even for UK manufactured products. If we end up with a no deal, we could end up with sharp falls in sterling against the euro and the dollar, which increases costs once again. And we saw that at the end of 2016 after the referendum, when we had a 15% fall in sterling versus the euro. And then in the first half of 2017, we saw double-digit inflation for timber, imported insulation, etc. Now, that's on the product side. But if we move to slide 6, then I've highlighted one of our key issues on the labour side. And this isn't highlighted as much by the media. But if you look at the chart I've put on slide 6, which is key labour issues, then you see that back in 2018, the grey-green line and the orange line is employment in construction that is from outside the UK. And the blue-grey line is UK-born employment in construction in London. And what you see is that foreign workers in London accounted for over half of construction employment in London. What we see over the last 2 years is that UK-born employment in London has risen by 5%, but EU construction employment has fallen by 54%. Now, construction in activity in London is relatively subdued at the moment because of that big impact on commercial, where activity is lower, but also productivity is lower. What could become a very big issue is if employment and activity in London picks up significantly after Brexit, because if quite a few of the EU workers have gone home because of the Brexit uncertainty over the last couple of years, because of COVID and the impacts they have there, because the depreciations in sterling mean for EU workers here, sending remittances back home just aren't worth it as much, then how are we going to fill the gap in employment going forward?
Look at the data from our own membership. We've recently been running a survey on immigration. Obviously, we're reaching into the unknown, so we can only start to sort of guess what might be happening in the new year. But I know some members are already talking, but we're already getting reports of about 30% of companies that will already have labour shortages. And about 2/3 of companies responding to our recent survey said that they are concerned about the new year. And I think for us as FIS, as we're tracking it, it seems to be, if we look at the sort of 3 ways in which we employ people in the sector, you've got employment, where we've got a relatively stable workforce. We've got the labour only subcontractor model, where people tend to have stronger relationships, and then there's the sort of the end of the chain, which is the agency and the gang workers, and that's where we see most of the problem manifesting. And I think we're probably at the whip end of this, because 70% of our workforce is not employed. So it falls into one of those other 2 categories, and over 40% of our members employ overseas workers.
I think the big issue for me is that after the 31st of December, we'll have a points-based immigration system, which really doesn't work for construction, because what it requires is employers paying to sponsor workers to come over. And if you look at construction employment generally, 41% of construction employment is self-employment. It relies on that ability to come in and meet demand relatively quickly for a project. and then go back or switch to another project. It doesn't work the same way as an investment banker. An investment bank may sponsor people from anywhere in the world to come over because they know they're going to need them long term. And because it's a high earning long term profession, then it's worth paying upfront for people to come over. However, with construction, 41% of employment is self-employment. 86% of employment in construction is from SMEs who don't have the resource to deal financially or even deal with the admin burden of bringing people on. And also dealing with points-based systems doesn't help when you need someone on your project next week. It works where you're dealing with a permanent contract and you know you're going to need an extra 20 people within your big corporation for the next 5 years, and you're going to take a general intake every year.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just as a quick point for people on the call, we have prepared some guidance on how to apply for settled and pre-settled status, and it's really important that we lock in the workforce that we do have and encourage and support them in completing. It's not a particularly onerous process, but it does seem to be putting some people off. And when we know rates are higher in places like Ireland, Germany, and creeping up in places like Poland with the currency that you've already covered, it's obviously a clear and present danger for January. And we've also prepared some questions that people can ask their workforce, some pre-prepared questions that you can ask your workforce in order to get a bit better intel. What I'll do is at the end of the conference, I'll make sure that's back to the front page of our website, so it's nice and easy for people to find. So Noble, looking sort of further ahead, so we've got the government comprehensive spending review tomorrow. So do we see a significant spend in areas like education and health coming through?
I think government will be very keen to make a lot of big announcements of capital investment. It's likely to be primarily in the infrastructure side, and government will be publishing a national infrastructure strategy tomorrow as well, which details a lot of the projects within that. It'll be £500 billion worth of investment, £100 billion of which is going to be in infrastructure in the north. And that's why I've been keen to highlight infrastructure as an area that traditionally you may not have been looking to for activity, but because there's so much activity going to be occurring in the next 5 years within infrastructure, it's worth looking into the detail of that, because you only need a niche to be able to get some of that activity. You're not looking at building a nuclear power station, but if you get some of the offices work that goes alongside the nuclear power station, that's still tens of millions of pounds. Again, if you get some of the retail opportunities that go with the rail construction, again, tens of millions of pounds of activity there. So have a look at infrastructure. There will be announcements of investment in education, and particularly health, but government has a tendency to just throw out 40 new hospitals without actually committing to where they're going to be. And unless you get the detail of where it's going to be and when, then I'd be a bit wary of that.
So maybe some big headlines, but not necessarily translating into immediate activity.
Yep.
So Noble, if we sort of move to the final question, if anybody has any questions for Noble, please do drop them in the comment section. But what companies do you see as going to be successful as the construction industry moves forward?
Well, I've put on my penultimate slide qualities that companies will need to have going forward. We're in a period of considerable uncertainty and things are changing constantly. So what companies will need to be is flexible. They'll need to be able to adjust to the market conditions. They'll need to be monitoring what's occurring in different sectors and how things are changing. They'll need to have a look at some of those new niches that traditionally companies wouldn't have looked in before. They'll need to be looking at what government is doing, given that most of the growth next year and the year after is going to be driven by government, either directly through funding of remediation, of cladding, of infrastructure investment, or indirectly through stimulating housing. And government is very keen long term to be pushing net zero, modern methods, and also digitalization. And the main quality companies will need to have is the ability to just look at the right timing for doing things, looking for that tipping point of when something becomes significant. And that's especially relevant to the net zero, modern methods, digitalization, because a lot of talk comes around these areas and they are going to be big long term. But what you don't do is just throw all your investment into these areas until it's the right time. And the example I've given is illustrated in the picture there, which is Kodak's first digital camera from 1975. And the image we have of Kodak is that they came up with the digital camera in 1975, and they decided not to bother further investment because it would eat into their traditional camera and film business. So they just forgot about it. And then they went into liquidation in 2012. It's slightly more complex than that. And what happened was the digital camera they came up with, you can see on the picture, it stored the picture on a cassette. It was 0.01 megapixels, and it had to be connected to a TV to see the picture. So it wasn't very practical, but they said, keep on developing it to their R&D department. And they kept on with their main business. And they were making lots of money with their traditional business of traditional cameras and film. In 1991, the R&D department came back to them and said, we've improved it and it's now 1 megapixel and it will rival your traditional cameras. And at that point, Kodak said, thanks, but we're making enough money off our traditional cameras and film. And that's the mistake they made in 1991, not back in 1975. So you need to be able to judge. At the moment, we're at 1975 in terms of net zero, modern methods, digitalization. But when we get to that 1991 point, that's when you need to be looking to invest in areas of net zero, modern methods, and digitalization.
That's something we're going to draw through in the next presentation, which is about the value toolkit. So we've got time for one very quick question is, and this is a very quick one, will the CPA be revising any of their forecasts in light of recent news on vaccines?
Not in light of vaccines at this point, because at the moment, there are two different types of vaccines, varying between 70% up to 90% effective, and then on the other type of vaccine, 94.5% effective and 95% effective. The usefulness of the vaccine is only going to be apparent, not just when it becomes available, but when it becomes widely available to everybody, because it needs to be widespread. So until it is widespread, and don't expect that, even if it initially becomes available to some people relatively soon, we don't expect that until spring at least, and more likely summer, to become widespread available to everybody. So the vaccine is unlikely to change things significantly in terms of our scenarios.
A message of hope for the future. Noble, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning. Apologies for the couple of issues we had with your slides, but I think you did exceptionally well in those circumstances. So once again, thanks Noble Francis, on behalf of FIS and our membership, thank you very much indeed.